He was supposed to be immortal, a symbol of truth and justice, a hero to every child in America. But when George Reeves died alone in his Los Angeles home in 1959, there were no crowds, no flowers, no parade. Not a single Hollywood A-lister showed up to mourn. The man who once wore the cape was sent off in silence. His funeral was so empty, it felt like the city had deliberately turned its back on him. So what happened to the man behind Superman? Why was his death swept under the rug? And why did the industry that built him suddenly want nothing to do with him? George Reeves was born George Kiefer Brewer on January 5, 1914 in Woolstock, Iowa. A small-town boy with big dreams, he was just a toddler when his parents split up and his mother moved them around from state to state. Eventually, they landed in California, where George's mother married Frank Besselo, who adopted George and gave him his last name. But that family too fell apart, and Reeves later discovered something devastating. His mother had told him. Frank died years ago, but that wasn't true. Frank was alive and well. The emotional betrayal haunted George for years, shaping the man he would become. Despite the instability of his childhood, George found peace and purpose on the stage. He loved music theater and performing anything that gave him an escape. After high school, he enrolled at Pasadena Junior College and then the famed Pasadena Playhouse. That's where he fell in love with acting and where he met his first wife, Eleanora Needles. They married in 1940, but like so many things in George's life, it didn't last. They divorced 10 years later. By then, George was already chasing stardom. His big break came in 1939 with a small role in Gone with the Wind. It wasn't a major part, but it was enough to get him noticed. Soon, he signed a contract with Warner Brothers and officially became George Reeves. The roles came quickly, but they weren't the kind of parts that make a star. Most of them were low-budget B-movies, forgettable films that didn't do much for his career. He later moved to 20th Century Fox, but it wasn't the change he hoped for. The roles were short-lived and shallow. Then came World War II, and everything changed. George enlisted in the Army Air Forces in 1943, putting his acting career on pause. He performed in Winged Victory, on stage and in film, but also dedicated himself to producing training films for soldiers. When the war ended, he returned to Hollywood with new hope and hard-earned experience. But Hollywood wasn't waiting for him. The golden age had moved on, and George found himself scraping for work. Sometimes he accepted bit parts. Other times he was literally digging cesspools just to pay the bills. Then came the offer that would define his legacy and haunt his future. In 1951, George Reeves was offered the role of Superman in a new TV series. At first he hesitated. Back then, television wasn't considered prestigious, and George still dreamed of film. But the show took off like wildfire, and overnight he became a household name. Kids saw him as a real-life superhero. Adults admired his strength, charm, and steady presence. But behind the mask and the smile, George was struggling. He quickly realized that being Superman wasn't a blessing. It was a trap. His contract with the show barred him from taking on other roles, and he became hopelessly typecast. Directors couldn't see past the cape. Studios didn't want to risk casting someone so closely associated with a children's show. To make matters worse, the pay was low. Shockingly low for the kind of fame he had attained. George was adored by millions, but he wasn't getting paid like it. He was stuck in a role he couldn't escape. One he had once hoped would save his career, now stood in the way of every other opportunity. And that was just the beginning, because George Reeves had plans to reinvent himself, plans that would take him far away from the shadow of Superman. But what happened next would bury those dreams for good. George Reeves didn't want to be Superman forever. He was proud of what the role meant to millions of fans, especially children. But he needed to grow. He wanted to act direct and create something that would finally prove he was more than just a man in a cape. So he came up with his own show, a project called Port of Entry. It was ambitious, adventurous, and unlike anything he had done before, George wrote the script himself and planned to shoot episodes in exotic locations like Mexico and Hawaii. But Hollywood wasn't interested. No studio stepped up to fund the show, and once again, the dream faded before it could take flight. At the same time, The Adventures of Superman was also running into problems. They couldn't find anyone else to take George's place. The production team realized just how irreplaceable he really was and offered him a massive pay raise, $5,000 a week. That was huge, especially for a show that only filmed a few weeks out of the year. George was tempted. He needed the money, but emotionally he felt torn. He was 45 years old, tired of the role, and desperate for a change. Still with few options and mounting financial pressure, he agreed to return. Preparations for the new season began. Writers were back at work. Costumes were being updated, and George was getting ready to step back into the role that made him famous. But then something happened, something no one expected. On June 16, 1959. George Reeves was found dead in his Benedict Canyon home from a gunshot wound to the head. The official story was suicide, but the details didn't add up. George wasn't alone in the house that night. His fiancée Leonore Lemon and a few friends were downstairs when the gun went off. Leonore claimed she was in the living room at the time, but others contradicted her. A friend later said she had rushed down the stairs saying, "Tell them I was down here. Tell them I was down here," over and over again. It was strange, unsettling, and left a cloud of suspicion. Then came the forensic inconsistencies. The gun found at the scene had no fingerprints on it. None, not even George's. There was no gunpowder residue on his hands either, and although 3 bullets were fired, only 1 was reportedly heard. 1 bullet lodged in the ceiling, the other 2 on the floor. All were fired from the same weapon, but no one could explain the extra shots. There were no signs of a break-in or struggle, and yet the whole scene felt off. The official verdict was suicide, but almost no one believed it. George's mother refused to accept the explanation. She believed her son had been killed and hired one of Hollywood's top attorneys, Jerry Giesler, to investigate. A second autopsy was performed revealing unexplained bruises on George's head and body. These weren't minor injuries. They suggested some kind of physical altercation, but with no witnesses and no solid evidence, the case went cold and Giesler eventually walked away. Convinced the gunshot had been self-inflicted, he dropped the case, but others weren't so sure. Friends, colleagues, and industry insiders whispered their own theories. Actor Rory Calhoun said flat out, "No one in Hollywood believed the suicide story. He wasn't alone." Stars like Alan Ladd and Gig Young shared his doubts. The rumors began swirling George's long affair with Toni Mannix. The wife of powerful MGM executive Eddie Mannix was no secret in certain circles, and Eddie Mannix was rumored to have ties to the Mafia. What if George's death wasn't about depression at all? What if it was a warning, a hit, a silencing? Just as he was about to marry Leonore Lemon and start a new life. The pieces didn't quite fit together, but the picture they created was chilling, and Hollywood took notice. Not publicly, but behind the scenes. Whispers turned into warnings. Friends were told to stay quiet and keep their distance, which may explain what happened at his funeral. George Reeves's funeral should have been a grand affair. A farewell to the man who gave America its first Superman. But instead, it was quiet, eerily quiet. Held at the Wayside Chapel of the Gates funeral home on July 1st, 1959, it was barely attended. No cameras, no public statements, no parade of stars. Only a handful of close friends came to say goodbye. People like Noel Neill, Don DeFore, and Gig Young showed up. But most of Hollywood's elite stayed far away. There was no major press coverage, no tributes, no eulogies from studio heads, no elaborate ceremony, just silence. And that silence spoke volumes. According to people close to the situation, word had spread behind the scenes that attending the funeral might not be a good idea. Some claimed industry insiders were actively discouraged from going, that people were warned to stay away. It wasn't just about grief, it was fear. George had been linked romantically to Toni Mannix, the wife of a powerful and well-connected studio executive, Eddie Mannix, a man rumored to have dangerous friends in organized crime. Some believed George's relationship with Toni had crossed a line, one that couldn't be forgiven, and when he ended it to marry Leonore Lemon, the theory goes someone made sure the final chapter of his life ended permanently. Hollywood knew how power worked and who held it. George's death may have been ruled a suicide, but few believed it, and fewer still dared to ask questions. His funeral became a metaphor for what the industry feared most: being seen connected to a scandal that couldn't be contained. Better to step back and stay silent than to become the next target. But the truth didn't stay buried. In 2006, the film Hollywoodland reopened the case for a new generation. The movie starred Ben Affleck as George Reeves and explored the darker side of his life and death. It didn't claim to solve the mystery, but it forced audiences to look at the facts again, to ask what really happened in that house on Benedict Canyon. The film revived public interest in the tragedy. Fans old and new began combing through the evidence again, looking for answers that had eluded everyone for decades. Some believed the official version, others pointed to the inconsistencies, the silence and the whispers that never truly died. Through all of this, one thing became clear. George Reeves had been more than just an actor in a costume. He was a man who wanted more, a man who tried to break free from the box Hollywood put him in. But every time he tried to take flight, he was pulled back down. He was trapped between two worlds. On one side was fame, on the other. Loneliness, adored by millions, but isolated by the very system that made him a star. He gave everything to a role that ultimately became his prison. And when he needed help most, the world turned its back. But there was still one part of George Reeves's story that fans never forgot. The part that revealed who he truly was, not just as Superman, but as a human being. Behind the suit, behind the fame, behind the endless reruns of him flying across black and white TV screens, George Reeves was just a man who cared deeply about doing the right thing. Even when he was at his lowest, George never forgot the responsibility that came with being Superman, especially to children. He understood that to them he wasn't just an actor, he was the real thing. That's why he refused to smoke in public, even though he was a smoker in private. He didn't want any kid to catch him lighting up and think it was okay. Eventually, he gave it up altogether, not for his health, but for his fans, for the kids who believed in him. George kept his personal life low-key. He avoided scandal, bad headlines, or anything that could tarnish the image young fans had of him. He showed up at events smiling, signing autographs, always taking time for children. Always kind, always humble, never letting fame get to his head. There was even a sign on his dressing room door that said, "Honest George, the people's friend." And later, after being named a Kentucky colonel, it was changed to Colonel Reeves. A small joke perhaps, but also a sign of the quiet respect people had for him. And it wasn't just appearances. George supported causes he believed in. He served as national chairman for the Myasthenia Gravis Foundation, using his fame to raise awareness for a rare and serious illness. He didn't do it for attention. He did it because he cared. Those who knew George Reeves never described him as bitter, angry, or arrogant. Even when he was frustrated with Hollywood, even when his finances were tight and his dreams stalled, he never lost his dignity or compassion. He treated everyone, from fellow actors to studio workers to fans, with the same level of respect. To the public, he was Superman. To Hollywood, he was a faded icon. But to those closest to him, he was simply honest George, the guy who tried to do right in a town that often didn't reward it. In the end, the tragedy of George Reeves is not just about how he died, but how he was forgotten. Forgotten by an industry that used his image but failed to support the man behind it. Forgotten by the media that chose silence over questions, and forgotten by many who owed their success to the foundation he helped build in early television. But today, fans still remember. They watch the reruns and smile, not just at the heroic poses, but at the man who brought them to life. The man who took the weight of being a role model seriously. The man who fought to redefine himself but was denied the chance. George Reeves wasn't perfect, but he was genuine. He lived with honor, loved with intensity, and tried to leave something good behind. In a world full of illusions, he was the rare kind of man who truly believed in heroes, and for a time, he was one. Maybe he didn't get the ending he deserved. Maybe his story was cut short before he could fly again. But for millions of people, George Reeves will always be remembered not just as Superman, but as a man who gave everything to live up to that name. And that may be the most heroic thing of all.